Welcome to the Peep Show podcast.
Your glance at sex and social justice.
With Jesse and PJ Sage. Hello, everyone. We are really excited to be back with yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. We are going to cover some really important topics today. First, we'll talk about sex work politics local to Pittsburgh, where we live. We are going to discuss what we did with the other members of SWOP Pittsburgh to fight against police charging sex workers for carrying condoms. Next, we will talk to Graydancer, a writer, sex and kink educator and presenter, and podcaster. He will talk to us about the likely impacts of FOSTA and SESTA on the kink communities.
Before we get started today, we wanted to give you a little update on our lives and the show.
Yeah, we have been super busy.
Really busy.
We've been really busy. So we're sorry that it's taken us a while to get another episode of the podcast out, but we've been doing a lot of community activism with Pittsburgh SWOP, and we're going to actually talk a little bit about what's been going on with that later in this show. But we've also been making clips and doing some writing.
And we both got jobs.
We did. We got jobs teaching in the same department at a university. So we are super stoked. In the meantime, we're trying to figure out how to balance all of this stuff. And what we've come up with is that we can keep the podcast going if we switch up the format a little bit.
Up until now, we've had 2 interviews on every show as well as a news segment. Over time, we've kind of expanded the news segment and also included some personal life updates. We're going to keep that, but we're going to cut back on one of the interviews, so it'll just be news and updates and then an interview each show.
This is going to be our first episode with the new format. And what we're going to do today is we are going to talk to Megan Guza, who's a reporter who broke a story that created a lot of activism in Pittsburgh. We're going to talk about our experience with that. And then we are going to interview Graydancer, who is a kink educator, about the impacts of FOSTA and SESTA on kink communities.
With us for our news segment today, we have Megan Guza. She's a criminal justice reporter for the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, where she has covered the cops, courts, and general chaos in Allegheny County and beyond for more than 3 years.
Hi, Megan. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
We came into contact with you because you wrote a piece in the Tribune-Review where you talked about prostitution arrests and their connection to condoms in Allegheny County. So can you tell us just briefly about the story?
Yeah, it's been something I've been trying to work on for, I think I started trying to get the ball rolling last year. And it involved taking a look at all of the arrests in Allegheny County last year on charges of prostitution, looking at the charges that also included possession of an instrument of crime. And so I took a look at those, and I was finding that some women and men who were being charged with prostitution were also being charged with possession of an instrument of crime based solely on having condoms on their person at the time that, they were arrested for prostitution.
Did that surprise you when you saw that?
Yeah, kind of indirect way, fairly direct as well, criminalizing safe sex.
Right.
That was our immediate reaction to the issue as well. What I found really shocking is that this possession of an instrument of crime charge is actually more serious than prostitution charges. Whereas prostitution is like a low-level misdemeanor, possession of an instrument of crime, which is what they're saying condoms is actually the highest level of misdemeanor.
Right, and county police detectives were making a majority of these arrests that I looked at. Their superintendent said it was on purpose because prostitution is considered a first-level misdemeanor, which generally you wouldn't be taken to jail for that if it was your first or second offense. You would be let go and you would get a summons in the mail.
Sure.
But possession of an instrument of crime is a third-level misdemeanor, the highest level of misdemeanor, that gets you taken to jail and booked into custody.
That was actually kind of shocking to hear them talk about it, because even when DA Zappala responded to us talking about this, one of the things that he said was, well, we usually drop these charges, as if that changes the situation for people who've now been booked into custody, who've had their fingerprints, who wouldn't have had any of these sort of interactions. had they not been charged with these instruments of crime.
Right.
Real quick, can you tell us what your findings were after you did all of that research into the way that prostitution was being charged in Allegheny County, which we should say is the county that encompasses Pittsburgh for people who don't live in the region?
Sure. Yeah. I requested cases for all of the individuals in the county who were charged with both of those crimes in 2017. And it worked out to about 100. And after going through those 100 cases, it worked out that there were 15 cases in which the individual was charged with possession of an instrument of crime solely because of the condoms. And just to clarify, all of these individuals were also charged with prostitution. No one was charged with possession of an instrument of crime just for carrying condoms.
Sure, right.
There was a lot of that going around on the internet in the aftermath of this story. So I think that's an important point to clarify.
Right.
But so there were 15 who were charged explicitly because of condoms with this possession of instrument of crime. And another 14 in which the condoms were seized as evidence. And in the rest of the cases, almost all of them, the possession of an instrument of crime charge was based on a cell phone, because a lot of these were, quote unquote, prostitution busts that were set up via Backpage. And, obviously you're using your phone to text and call and set up these meetings. So that's what the rest of the charges were based on.
Right. So what would happen then is that like an undercover cop would answer an ad and use a telephone to call the person who was offering services and then bust them for answering those calls on those phones.
Right.
While the condom issue, it's pretty clear why that's a safety issue for providers. Cell phones are also an important safety tool for providers because they allow them to make safe calls to trusted friends or partners. And they also allow providers to access emergency services. So part of this story ultimately was that, like condoms, phones too are part of the health and safety protections that providers employ on the job. And so that is also a little bit disconcerting that these are treated as instruments of crime.
Yeah, it's interesting because I heard you talk before about how you got all of these files. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Pennsylvania is notoriously bad when it comes to open records or getting really any kind of records anywhere. And for some reason in Pennsylvania, even though it's 2018, you still can't search for cases by charge. You have to search by name or a court docket number. So I had to send a request to Harrisburg and request, all the cases in Allegheny County in 2017 in which an individual was charged with, and then the statute name for both charges, and then wait on those. And eventually I got them, and all I had was a list of names and the case number.
Yeah.
So from
this
there,
was quite a project.
It was a lot of paperwork just to get these files in my hand. Because then you have to send the case numbers to the court records office in the county courthouse, and they have to pull all of them. And they're actual paper files. They're not digital. And then they want to charge 50 cents a page to make copies. So I had to sit there and scan all of them with my phone. It was an ordeal.
Oh, geez. Wow.
Yeah. So where our lives intersected is right after you published that article, my inboxes in my email and my Twitter and everything else went nuts with people asking how I was going to respond to your article because I'm the co-chair of Pittsburgh SWOP, the sex worker outreach project, and PJ works on that with me. So suddenly we were kind of bombarded with a lot of people, including other media people in Pittsburgh, asking what the response from SWOP was going to be.
And lawyers.
And lawyers. Yeah,
like
all
for
sorts of
different,
folks.
public associations.
Yeah, it was actually really interesting for us because it wasn't even on our radar. And then all of a sudden it turned our whole world upside down for a short amount of time.
Which, by the way, dear listeners, is why this podcast is coming to you very late.
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry.
It's all connected. No, but it was actually really interesting. So what we decided to do, because there was a lot of different Pittsburgh-based organizations who wrote to us and asked us if we had thoughts about how to handle this, we set up an open forum where we invited a bunch of different organizations like the ACLU and the Pittsburgh DSA and Planned Parenthood and the Women's Law Group and a lot of social justice-oriented groups in Pittsburgh. And I reached out to you and told you that it was happening because I didn't really want you to be surprised. And you came, which I thought was amazing. And so I was curious what you thought about being there, seeing a whole bunch of folks organize around a story that you researched for a year.
Yeah, as on a base level, just as a journalist, it was a little surreal because, I mean, all you ever want is to affect change or action or anything like that.
Yeah.
But on a whole different level, it was one thing to sit and read these criminal complaints and to read stories out of New York and San Francisco where they've effectively done away with this practice.
Right.
It was another thing to actually sit there and hear stories from, people who were actually directly affected by this practice.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to kind of hear the outrage that came from the people who were with the ACLU and the Women's Law Center. Because I thought it was kind of a shady practice, but to hear the word unconstitutional thrown around was kind of shocking.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have backgrounds in law, so I totally deferred to them for that. But from our perspective, we were like, this seems entirely unsafe and inhumane.
Right.
No, I also thought it was really interesting to hear the sort of outrage from the legal perspective, but definitely for us, it was a public health concern and just
and a human rights concern.
Exactly, yeah.
What happened that night is that we ended up building a coalition with a lot of different groups, many of whom we already named, and writing an open letter to DA Zappala about why we think that he should make a statement against this practice. And at first that didn't go over very well.
Yeah, I was several hundred miles away when that happened, but I was watching very closely. I was on vacation.
Right.
And I was kind of surprised at his response because, in my personal opinion, it kind of sidestepped the entire issue. For lack of better phrasing.
Yeah, I should say for people who weren't following this that are listening, basically he wrote back within an hour. So he already knew it was coming, I'm assuming, because he couldn't have done that so quickly. But
well, we made clear it was coming. I mean, we put out a press release and everything.
Right. So, but he opened his letter to us saying that he wouldn't have even responded to a group like SWOP. I think he referred to us as like, what words did he use? I wish I had it in front of me right now.
Oh, I don't know, but
like,
it was...
He insinuated that we're a criminal organization.
Right.
Right.
We represent a group that, is illegal in the state of Pennsylvania, and then said that he's only responding because he respects the other groups that signed on to the letter, which, of course, implies that a harm reduction, an anti-stigma organization like SWOP is not worthy of respect,
right,
even if it's comprised of his own constituents.
Yeah.
And so we responded to that as well, but it continued to generate a lot of press, and I think there was an extraordinary amount of concern within the community with regard to these practices because it really is an obvious public health threat.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I should say that, part of the point that we are making, and I think that when you're talking about discouraging condom use or any sort of policy that disincentivizes condom use for sex workers, you're also impacting the safety of their clients, partners, of their clients' partners, right? So it has ripple effects throughout the community.
What ultimately ended up happening, which I think is a result of all of the stories that came in the wake of your story and all of the kind of media coverage that it was getting, is that the police chief of Allegheny County ended up making a statement that said that they will no longer be classifying condoms as instruments of crime. Although didn't say that they wouldn't be used as evidence of prostitution, and also said that cell phones would still continue to be used as instruments of crime. I was curious what you made of that statement.
Well, it was a little bit surreal because things started out a flurry of activity, and then I know there was a lot going on in the background, but on my end of things, things kind of calmed down a little bit. And then all of a sudden, it was one day last week, it might have been a week ago today, the superintendent called me and said, hey, we're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to file possession of an instrument of crime charges based on condoms.
Yeah.
Which was surprising. I did not expect that to happen, quite frankly.
We actually didn't expect it to happen either. To the point that I was a little confused by the whole thing.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you the driving factor, behind his decision. But that was the statement that he put out. And, he said, doesn't mean that you'll never see the word condom mentioned in an affidavit of probable cause, because, discussion of condoms might be used as evidence of prostitution or whatever. But did very plainly say that they don't plan to file that charge based on condoms anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, while that is positive in the sense that it puts Allegheny County in line, I think, with, a little closer with much the rest of the country, or at least the rest of Middle America, we're still far off of the movements in New York and California, which have, in which cases this instruments of crime charges never existed in the first place, but also banned the use of condoms as evidence in these cases, because the fear is still the same that if you treat condoms as evidence of intent to commit crime,
right,
ultimately that acts as a disincentive to carrying condoms. And from a public health perspective, it's not in the government's interest to do anything that discourages safer sex.
Right.
And so I think that's still the concern, is while they have stopped this more egregious practice that really wasn't being done in most of the rest of the country, that only now puts them kind of in line with, some of the less progressive places in the country. And on top of that, they're still leaving themselves plenty of opening to use cell phones as a way to extort a plea bargain on prostitution. So my sense is that they were sort of hey, the optics of this condom thing is really bad. We can still accomplish the very same goal because everybody carries cell phones and is using cell phones or computers in this kind of work today. So let's just use that to extort a plea bargain. Let's forget about the condom thing. It won't make our job any harder, and we can look progressive on this issue. And so that is my concern, and I don't know. We'll see how it plays out, in coming years, and what those kind of policing practices look like.
It does seem like a step, though.
Yeah.
It is a step. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about the reporting that you did is that he actually did say, wow, this is happening. I did a little internal investigation and it's happening more than I thought. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Well, and it's a step because at least it expresses a recognition that the police should balance public health priorities with policing priorities. So if we can start with that acknowledgement, then we're at least in the same ballpark, to have a conversation. Whereas, my concern with DA Zappala is that there wasn't a lot in the way of recognition that he, as a public official, has an important role to play in ensuring public health. And I do think that really needs to be the basis of community conversations going forward, how to balance the various priorities.
Yeah. Are there any other reflections that you had about going through this whole process?
I mean, I guess I can only really speak to it from, the standpoint of a journalist, which is it's the first time in my career that I've actually seen my own reporting spur a movement or do something.
Yeah.
Which sounds really disparaging to the last 6 years of my career. But As in, like, this was tangible, like a tangible policy change.
Right.
So, and again, I don't know how many listeners you have who are journalists, but that's how it came across to me, and was kind of what's the word I'm looking for? It was encouraging, because now it's again tangible evidence that things can be changed, even if it is just a small step on a small level.
Yeah. I would really like to thank you for putting all of the time and effort and energy into the story that you did. It was really amazing. It was really fantastic.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Where can people find your work?
Triblive.com is the Trib's website. You can find me. I'm most active on Twitter at Megan Guza Trib. That's Guza Trib. Those are probably the best places.
All right. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We are here today with Graydancer, who's been teaching, performing, and advocating for kink and BDSM since 2003. His work includes the Ropecast, the longest-running kink podcast on the web. He is passionate about subjects such as rope, power exchange, leather, cigars, consent in the community, performance, and educational aspects of kink. So thank you so much for coming on today.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here.
We have you in our bedroom today because you happen to be in Pittsburgh, and this is where we record, so it's kind of fun to do a face-to-face. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing in Pittsburgh right now.
So I come here every year about this time for the last 7 years. We have what's called the GRU, which stands for Graydancer's Rope-tastic Unconference Extravaganza. And
that's fantastic.
You can tell why we call it the GRU. People can look at gru.space is the website for it. And it's been going on since 2007. This was, I think, the 79th. I've kind of lost count.
That's so wild.
And we have we've done it all over North America. We've done 6 of them in Europe. And we basically go to cities, and it's an unconference that is based around open space principles. And what happens is Friday night we have a meet and greet, just hang out, say hi to everybody. Saturday we get together and we have a few exercises based on open space that help us create an agenda right there of what we're going to do during the day, of different classes. And the only rule is that you have to be passionate about the class.
Okay.
You have to really, really want, be interested in that. And so some of it is technical stuff like, how to tie a certain harness or something like that. It's not limited to rope. So like we had a class called Impact. That was a guy just bringing out all of his floggers and paddles and whips and things like that and letting people try them out and talking about them and sharing them. We had a whole group of hook suspension type things going on.
We went to, there's a club here called The Body Shop, and we went on Good Friday, and there was somebody who was doing hook suspension then, and they set it up like a crucifixion scene.
Okay. What did this guy look like?
With like a crown of thorns and everything.
Yeah. He was like a bigger guy. He
Did he have a white hair and a ponytail?
That was, yes.
Did he have?
Yep, that's the same guy who was there.
That was the craziest thing I've ever seen.
He
He put a crown of thorns on the woman and suspended her from her back and her arms, and she had blood running down her face.
Yeah, he did that at the GRU last year, too.
Did he?
Yeah, he did that too, and this time he did some other things. Yeah, but so you have a wide spectrum of things. The interesting thing is that some of the longest classes and the most well-attended ones are ones that are just conversations, which at first surprised me, but then I realized that at most events, at regular conferences, and I know this because I do it too, there's a lot of pressure on the organizers to come up with hard skills. When you leave, you'll be able to tie 5 different, kinds of single column ties. And the discussions don't happen as much, but they happen at GRUs a lot.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So like we had discussions on how to make rope education more accessible. We've had discussions on female dominance, on lots of things about consent, about polyamory, about power exchange. And one of the first ones that happened there, and the one that kind of blew my mind because I thought I knew all the some of the implications, and this one made me even more scared, was a discussion on SESTA and FOSTA.
Yeah, that's actually why we wanted to have you on the show, because we've been talking a lot about and writing a lot about the implications of FOSTA and SESTA on sex workers, obviously, because that's so immediate, but it seems to us like it has far-reaching consequences. So we want to talk to you about that. But I want to first ask you another question, actually, just because I'm curious. Do you notice, since this is an unconference and you don't go in with particular agendas, that there's big regional differences between what people are interested in?
That's a good question. Yes and no. I know there's always going to be a class on polyamory. Like somebody's going to want to talk about that. Somebody's always going to want to talk about power exchange in some respect. Over the years, we've seen more bottoming education and things like that going on. But at the same time, and it's kind of surprising, I don't want to out people, but there was one GRU that took place only, maybe 2 hours away from another city.
Okay.
And some people from the northern city came down to the southern city. Now, the southern city had a rule against any kind of breath play. Like, you could not do any kind, you couldn't even have a hand, just resting on somebody's throat.
The whole city had a rule?
The city, the community in that. The rope community there. And they had a rule against that at their play parties and their educational events.
Okay.
Now, the GRU is kind of its own educational event, and so they didn't have a exact rule against talking about it. And so the people from the city 2 hours north, who happened to be into that kind of play, gave a very, very great and thorough demonstration right up until the point of actually doing it. And it was kind of funny watching the way that some people were like uncomfortable, but they were riveted.
Yeah.
And other people were like, oh yeah, finally we're talking about this, because some rules are really hard to enforce.
Right. Yeah. It's also interesting, like how there can become like cultural norms in specific places where it's taboo to do this thing here and it's normal in another community.
I was at a party at one place, and I was playing with a partner of mine, and I had my shirt off, and at one point, Can we be explicit on this podcast?
Go ahead.
So at one point, as part of the play, I was literally taunting her with my cock, like just it was. But I was wearing my jeans. I just unzipped and apparently somebody walked past where we were playing and saw it, because when I came downstairs to the party, everybody was looking at me and whispering, and my friend came and said, "Hey, dude, you got naked," and I'm like, "Well, first of all, no, I didn't, but so what?" It's like, tops don't do that here.
Wow.
And it was just kind of like, it was bringing somebody to get a rope, It's just really, it was kind of funny. So yeah, there's definitely lots of blood and needles up in Seattle, and lots more paddling and spanking out on the East Coast. And in the Midwest, you will find some of the best rope bondage you'll ever found that nobody's ever heard of, because they don't live on the coast.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Which is kind of surprising.
And that's actually interesting to us, too, because like we've always kind of thought, being out of Pittsburgh, that like that's one of the unique things we do as a podcast, is have a perspective that's
not New York, LA, or San Francisco.
Exactly. And that's something we're always interested in, is highlighting people who aren't, not that we don't talk to people from those cities or from the coast, but also thinking about what's going on in the rest of the country when it comes to like sex and social justice and other things that we're interested in, because I think there are a lot of interesting stories and perspectives, so it's always cool to hear about that.
Yeah, I started the Ropecast in 2005 literally because I was sick of hearing about everything happening in Florida, New York, and Seattle.
Yeah,
which was basically the entire rope community at that time. And I'm like, we're going to have something in the flyover states.
Yeah.
And
so let's get to FOSTA and SESTA. So tell us what came out of that class.
Can we swear?
Yeah.
We're fucked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's so I've been a sex worker myself. I'm sex worker adjacent in so many different ways that I was just very aware of it anyway, and very concerned about things going on, and especially since I run the GRUs, and I also run a regular conference called Ropecraft.
Right.
So I was just thinking, okay, this might be interesting. And a friend of mine, Deb, I don't know if I can say her last name, so I won't say her last name, but she runs the Philly Music Hall, and which is a great kink space. Everybody should go there. So, man, enjoy it. But it's a civic organization. And she said, well, we're really concerned because of what this law says about the payment processors.
Yeah.
And that's not something that is necessarily focused on by the sex worker community because you've already been screwed over by this payment processors.
Oh, but it's gotten worse.
It has gotten worse.
It's gotten worse, yeah.
We personally had to make a run on the ATM.
Because one of the First Choice, Payoneer, like shut down the day before SESTA was signed into law.
Wow.
They went out of business coincidentally on the day before.
Wow,
and
funny how that
so
happened.
the platforms that we worked on sent emails out to everybody that was like, pull all your money off the Payoneer visas. Like, so everybody was running to the ATMs trying to get as much money as possible off.
Wow, a literal run on the banks.
It really was.
It was a literal run on the banks.
I never thought that, like, I would live to experience, but we were
Mary
like...
Poppins. I mean,
It was like 5:00 though, and we were like, we need to go now. I, had to take my son somewhere, and then I was like, we're going to the bank, and then he actually was like, why is this taking so long? And it's because I had to do it. Like, I mean, I didn't tell him what I was doing, but he's sitting in the car, and I'm taking out, one transaction, and then another transaction, and somebody's in the line, and I think they're wondering, what is she doing? I'm pulling all my money out.
Yes.
before it disappears.
And I, a long time ago, got banned by PayPal.
Right.
Because they spotted boobies on my website on the same thing where I had a donation button for the podcast. And so I was concerned on that level of things. So I thought that the conversation that we were going to have at the GRU about this was going to be mainly about, payment processors and, we'll just do Bitcoin, that'll solve everything. Something that's very sarcastic.
Right.
So, but we actually didn't talk much about payment processors at all, because the other person who was presenting with Deb goes by the name Audrey Hepburn, and I wanted to make sure I gave her credit. And I should preface, she is not a lawyer, and neither am I.
Okay.
So you have all of the accuracy of non-lawyers reading off the internet. But one of the things that SESTA FOSTA really changed was it gave a federal definition of sexual contact. And that's one of the things that was originally a regional difference from place to place. Different places have different laws about what you can do, what you can't do, what you can show, what you can't. And it's by no means is it like, that's a liberal place, you can do anything you want there. I mean, it can be a liberal place and really closed-minded in terms of sexuality, and it can be a totally red state, and you can fuck anything you want.
Yeah. So what definition did it give?
States used to do it. So here's where it gets scary, and I'm going to slip into legalese. I'm reading off my phone here. This is from law.cornell.edu.
Okay.
The term sexual contact means, and just so you know, there's going to be A through D and then a number 3. So it means contact between the penis and the vulva. Now, we know we're fucked if they're actually using the word vulva instead of vagina, because it means they actually know what they're talking about in terms of this. Or the penis and the anus. And for purposes of this subparagraph, contact involving the penis occurs upon penetration, however slight. So you can't get away with just the tip anymore. Contact between the mouth and the penis, the mouth and the vulva, or the mouth and the anus. The penetration, however slight, of the anal or genital opening of another genital opening. By a hand or finger or by any object. And here's a fun little phrase here. With the intent to abuse, humiliate, harass, degrade, or arouse or gratify. How's that for a nice little grouping of things?
That's a double barrel definition.
Yeah, exactly. The sexual desire of any person. Not necessarily the recipient, not necessarily the person given, of any person, or the intentional touching, not through the clothing, of the genitalia of another person, and this is the age thing, who has not yet attained the age of 16 years. So they've also apparently established the age of consent now. And then in part 3, they say the term sexual contact means, and here's where we really get fucked, means the intentional touching, either directly or through the clothing, of genitalia, anus, groin, breast, inner thigh, or buttocks of any person, and they bring back that phrase again, with the intent to abuse, humiliate, harass, degrade, or arouse or gratify the sexual desire of any person.
Wait, but do they mean for money, or do they mean...
They mean that's what they call...
What are they talking about?
When they talk about sexual acts and regulate, where they say, you can't be paid for sexual... This is what they mean by sexual act, and they mean that, a lot of the talk in this is that it's the problem, the reason why they had to shut down Craigslist personals and things like that and Backpage is because they're holding people responsible for anything that facilitates or aids this kind of money for sexual acts.
Right.
And you don't have to prove it. You don't have to prove this there. You just have to be facilitating it.
Right.
So on the one hand, I run sex positive events.
Right.
There is a lot of touching of the anus and the vulva and things like that in our events. And that's, up until now at least, was always legal. And technically it would still be legal, except now they can say, well, we know that you're sex worker friendly, Gray, so we think you're facilitating these things so that you can, give people a chance to do that.
Because we have no idea how narrowly or broadly.
Exactly.
One thing is that FOSTA SESTA allows the different DAs in all 50 states to bring suits. And all of those different DAs presumably are going to interpret this very differently. So even if the DA in Pennsylvania is like, yeah, cool, run this event, you go to another state, and
it's federal. So really the states don't necessarily even have the right to make their own decisions on that. And here's the thing. There are some events, like I said, my events were like, hey, let's get gushy. This is cool. There are some events where they're like, no, we are just about kink. We are purely about, we are not having sexual contact.
Right.
Well, the thing is that their definition of sexual contact and the federal government's definition of sexual contact are not the same.
Right.
I mean, they're talking about any contact, including through the clothing. So if you're using your flogger on somebody wearing a leather vest, if they look like they're happy, then, or it's turning on somebody else in the vicinity.
Right, that's the weird part, right? So some third-party bystander is turned on, and then the thing that you're doing is a problem.
So if I go to, if you go to the gynecologist...
But see, that's what if you're getting around... Sorry.
Well, whatever. And you're like, oh, man, I'm getting really aroused here. Like, can you have the cops come in and arrest the guy? Like, at what point? Like, it just seems to me that these definitions are so loose.
Remember, it talks about touching of clothing, especially on those areas. How many clubs are going to have to ban grinding?
Right.
I mean, it's like that's where, so that, to me, that kind of, the fact that they made the law so broad that it... it's kind of like when, one of the southern states accidentally outlawed sex when they said you cannot have sex with any animal, and somebody pointed out that humans are animals. So it's kind of like, I think eventually it'll be shut down.
Yeah.
But the thing is that the thing of, they can't convict us of that. Yeah, you're right. They can't convict you of that, but they can arrest you. Mm-hmm. They can shut down your event. They can come in, and I worry that the police and things like that in towns will feel that this gives them the ability to either shut down the organization or to take advantage of it, in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah,
right, or at least just like harass the organization in such a way that it becomes untenable to have the event. Because, like, at the very least, then you're stuck in a situation where you have to pay a bunch of legal fees and,
absolutely.
And since a lot of organizations aren't going to be able to do that, it ends up being like a de facto form of censorship, right? Like,
it's totally,
they can just kind of bring up, whatever, like almost like nuisance arrest, like the way that we have like nuisance lawsuits or whatever,
right?
Just as a way of silencing people because it seems to be so incredibly broad.
I mean, I know there are some people that will hear this, and then other event producers said, Gray, they wouldn't, they could do that, but they won't do that.
Right.
And I don't have that kind of faith in the government or the local law enforcement. I have been at clubs and events that have been raided. There was one time that a GRU had the police called on them because...
What for?
So it was a combination of things. One problem was that, I work with local organizers. Like I just set up the event. In that particular venue, the local organizer had not actually told the people who ran the venue what kind of event we were running.
What?
They just said, we're having a party. And that's all they said. So when a person peeked in to the party to see what was going on at his venue or his organization's venue, he saw a naked woman on a spanking bench who... was being, they were demonstrating something that they call fire cutting. There's no actual cutting in it.
Okay.
But it's knife play, it's a sensual knife play. But you basically use a little bit of hand sanitizer and light the end of the edge on fire.
Okay.
So the feeling, it looks really impressive.
Yeah.
Feeling wise, it's just sensual and warm. It's not any pain. Certainly no actual cutting is involved. But that's what this person saw. And this is a person who had no exposure to kink at all.
Right.
So he called the police and said we were branding women.
Wow.
And they showed up with their search gloves on, and they were the particular leader. I remember very clearly. He not only was wearing his uniform, but on his collar he had 2 little crosses. So we had the religious aspect going on, and I'm sitting here wearing a shirt with a picture of a little cartoon woman tied up and smiling, and I mean, it worked out okay. That we were lucky in that they happened to come in at a time when everybody in the crew was in some kind of conversational thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
If they had showed up earlier, they would have seen, my girlfriend dangling from an ankle trying to dip an Oreo in a cup of milk with her mouth. So, but at the time we were all dressed just completely. Our mutual friend Twisted View was there.
Okay.
And managed to tell the police, what are we doing here? Well, we're doing different exercises to develop intimacy and trust between loving consenting adults. And which is entirely true.
Right.
You got to say the truth. You have to say it in a way that he can then get on the radio and say, yeah, it's one of those relationship intimacy things. Not a big deal. Nothing bad's going on.
That stuff is so difficult, though. So, I mean, this is a little bit different, but I had a similar experience where I went to give a talk at a club in Toronto, a dirty talk seminar, when asked why I was crossing the border. I said the thing that was true, which is I'm giving a seminar, and they're like, a seminar about what? Oh, about like relationships and communication. Oh, well, where? Well, at a sex club. Well, and we got detained for a fairly long amount of time while my social media was combed through because they were, looking for evidence of sex work. But I mean, it was just a teaching job,
Yeah.
And they eventually let me go, but they made it pretty clear that they might not have,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I have a very dear friend of mine who used to teach down here rope stuff. She's amazing. And she has done professional escorting in the past as well. And she, at some point, got flagged at the border and is now banned from the U.S. for 10 years.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's horrifying because we were close friends.
Yeah.
And, and she's also from Toronto. And I think that's one of the things, the other thing that I think
But that's stuff when you're doing anything with even legal work, anything with like sex communities, and it gets wrapped up in legal stuff and they're asking you to account for what you're doing. It's very complicated.
And it's going to be a little more easy for, for you and me, actually.
Yeah.
And I hope you don't mind me outing like this, but, we are both white, cisgendered people.
Yeah.
So we are going to have that kind of privilege in talking with the authorities that other people would not have. I mean, there are people I know who, if they had been the one talking to the police, would have gotten a very different reaction from the police.
Right, for sure.
And so, to me, the reason we need to all fight this, whether we're sex workers or not, because our brothers and sisters and friends and family that are chosen family that are doing this kind of stuff may be affected even if we aren't.
Right. I 100% agree with that. I mean, we've had a lot of really explicit conversations about that, even in like starting SWOP that, I recently talked to the city paper about representing sex workers, and I thought I can do that, and I feel like a responsibility to do that because I have a certain amount of privilege, because the work that I've done has been legal. I feel like the people who can interface with the law should stand up for the people who don't have that sort of privilege.
And I think that also raises a broader issue about like FOSTA, SESTA, which is like who was brought to the table in the first place to even like discuss all these definitions and what this bill was. And I mean, of course, this bill was rushed through, so almost nobody got to talk about it.
Right.
But the people who did were certainly not the affected groups. Like many of the stakeholders, like the entire kink and BDSM community, actual consensual sex workers, even legal sex workers, totally excluded from these conversations. And I think that's really problematic, and part of the reason that there's so much fear around this bill and why I think it probably will be so harmful is because, groups that are doing things that are perfectly legal, or up until now have been perfectly legal and are occurring between consenting adults,
Right.
just totally weren't brought to the table. And I do think this fits a broader pattern as well, like in terms of how this bill came to be crafted, because, you know, there's this historical trajectory. If we look back, the same people, the people who are involved in the present day anti-trafficking campaigns, which, I mean, of course, trafficking is abhorrent, and to the degree it's happening, I think we all agree it's abhorrent. Like everybody, both in the kink community and sex work communities, like consent is really, really important.
I absolutely think trafficking in the domestic servant and the food service industry should definitely be stopped.
You know,
we should definitely, exactly.
You know, all of these things.
Adjunct professors. That's where we came from.
But maybe that's a little extreme. But but there's certainly exploitation. But no, I mean,
I'm only kind of kidding.
But there is legit, there's legit trafficking, and I think in a lot of industries, and we should really be concerned with that, and more broadly with like workplace exploitation, and particularly for people who are coerced into having sex. Like, completely agree. Now, we have really shitty data on all of that, so we don't have a good sense of like how much that's actually occurring. We just have a lot of rhetoric. But the concern is actually that the people who were pushing the bill, the people who were brought to the table on this bill, were people who historically come out of the anti-pornography movement, the anti-sex work movement, which is also deeply tied to the anti-BDSM movement, who take the extreme position that consent is impossible, both within the context of sex work and within the context of power exchange. And so...
But they don't stop to ask the people who participate in that whether they feel like...
Or if they do, they just assume that they're being,
they're operating under bad faith or something.
Exactly right. You're operating under false consciousness. And I just think that's the core of the problem to me, is those people were brought to the table in crafting this legislation, yet the people who were most directly affected by the legislation were completely absent. And the idea that you're legislating about somebody else and telling somebody else how they ought to be doing things. I mean, the profound irony, right? Like, that's the definition of violating consent, right? Like, like that's like systemic.
Let me help you, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess to me that's like the big underlying structural issue, but also I think why like the kink community and the sex work community really has to come together on this, because we're both equally implicated in this long history that I think dates back to certain elements of like second wave feminism.
The broader picture to me is that, and this is like goes back to my fiction that I write about, is that if you can make people feel guilty about things that they want to do naturally, you've got a measure of control over them. And so by turning this stuff that people do into crimes, they're increasing their control. I mean, I tend to look at the whole idea of that kind of repression as a measure of the people in control wanting to maintain that, So the same way that parents will sometimes make kids feel guilty about things because, that way it's not going to stop them, but it'll make them feel ashamed of it, and that gives you some measure of control over them by being able to shame them.
Right.
Someone said that being sex positive is not about not doing anything you're ashamed of. It's about not being ashamed of anything you do.
Yeah. I like that.
And that I think is kind of the key here, is that, they're saying these things are shameful and you shouldn't do them.
Yeah.
And instead we need to say, well, no, these things aren't shameful. Sorry. It's not, that's just the way it is.
It's so funny because I feel like in my work, particularly in my phone sex work, I spend so much time just doing that. People will call me and there's a ton of things that they're ashamed about. And my response is always like, I think that's okay. Which sometimes isn't what they want. Like, a lot of times what they want is for me to say, yeah, you should be really embarrassed, because it's playing out of that.
Right,
and that's fine. I'll like do that. But really, I'm like, I think it's all right. It's okay. It's all okay. Just do what you want to do.
Yeah. I have a friend who on Tinder had a guy say, yeah, I'm into kink too, but none of that weird stuff like knives and electricity and what was the other thing he said? Needles. And we were kind of like, that's the weird stuff? I'm like, a jar of peanut butter, 3 ping pong balls, and electric mixer. That's weird stuff. But
or the Oreo cookie.
Yeah, exactly. Or the Oreo cookie.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I feel like a little bit hopeless because I don't necessarily think it happened. If I had my way, if I could just wave my magic wand and do stuff, I would say, let's all band together and stand together, and from the owners of strip clubs to the owners of kink clubs to the cam workers to the high-end call girls and everybody in between and all the escort services, let's all band together and stand and say, look, this is not going to work. But I think instead what they're doing is, because we're all sitting there going, well, that's not me.
Yeah.
That's them. They're picking us off one by one by one. Because
that's my fear. And that's what I think happens internally in these communities.
I mean, queer porn is going to tell you that, well, when they decide fisting is not allowed to be shown.
Right.
Well, they've already had that experience. It's kind of like with the payment processors.
Yeah, right.
We've been going, the event producers have been saying, well, yes, that's horrible what's happening to them, but, my bottom line is still okay.
Right.
And then suddenly your bank tells you that, Eventbrite decides that they're not going to let you use tickets anymore.
Right.
And suddenly we're in the same position that the sex workers have been in for a long time.
Right.
And we're suddenly coming to you and saying, how do I get people to pay?
Right.
What am I going to do? How do we get people to pay, by the way?
I think everybody's still trying to figure that out.
Amazon gift cards.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Which is basically a barter economy. Oh, my God.
No, I think actually we're kind of getting there. But, I mean, in truth, that's how you get your 100% payout, is get an Amazon gift card, go buy food at Whole Foods. There's really, which wouldn't be my number one choice, but they're owned by Amazon, so...
No, yeah, I hear you. I'm wishing I could think of anything to argue with you on that, but I can't.
I mean, we all want Bitcoin and other things to work, but good luck. If you want to gamble, you just have to be okay with losing half your money overnight. Mm-hmm. That's not really reasonable. So there's, there's not a good way. And this is what's hard with the sex work community, is what you end up finding is that options come and go, but they come and go at a really great cost. And so you're paying a 30%, 40% overhead on payment processing, which in any other sector of the economy, including payday lending, would be absolutely outrageous.
But it's just the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
But for sex workers, it's the cost of doing business. And I think that's a real problem. But unfortunately, we just don't have the allies and positions of power, who are willing to stand up and do anything about it.
Thanks so much for joining us. Where can people find your...
I'm so easy to stalk on the internet. Graydancer, Graydancer. Graydancer.com. I'm Graydancer on Twitter for a while, at least.
Till we all get kicked off.
The Ropecast is libsyn.com/Graydancer.
Okay.
And I do a lot of public speaking in terms of on issues of consent, power exchange. I'm in a 24/7 power exchange relationship with my partner Naya, who also does speaking and a lot of things in bottom advocacy and things like that. So yeah, I'm very easy to find and happy to talk to people. And I'm Graydancer at pm.me if you the Proton Mail. So
that's great. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Keep your eyes peeled for the second half of this conversation, where we talk to Graydancer about the impact of FOSTA and SESTA on the kink community. It will appear on Graydancer's podcast, The Ropecast. You can find his podcast at graydancer.libsyn.com.
Thank you for joining us for yet another episode of the Peep Show podcast. I'm PJ Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at PeachSage.
And I'm Jessie Sage, and you can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or at jessiesage.com.
We would like to remind you that we have a Patreon account and would appreciate your support. Please visit patreon.com/peepshowpodcast. Our music is courtesy of Joe Kennedy. The show was produced by Jessie and PJ Sage.
Signing off. Have a great week.